Recording in progress.
Namaskara and good evening. My name is Sanjana. Apologies, just give me a minute, please. Namaskara and good evening. My name is Sanjana, and on behalf of the archives at the National Center for Biological Sciences and our collaborators at NIMHANS, I warmly welcome you all to the third and final edition of the Obaid Siddiqi Lecture Series for 2022. The Obaid Siddiqi Chair in the History and Culture of Science and these lectures have been made possible through the generous support of TNQ Technologies. The archives at NCBS is a public center for the history of contemporary biology in India. Our primary aim is to house historical material that speaks broadly to the development of sciences in our country. Alongside this core aim, we work towards outreach through workshops, a public lecture series, and exhibitions in our gallery space. And we do this to engage a variety of audiences with the possibilities that an archive of science holds. The archives at NCBS is closely tied to the legacy of Obaid Siddiqi, the founder of NCBS. I would like to invite Professor Satyajit Mayer, Center Director, to give us an insight into how the Obaid Siddiqi Chair in the History and Culture of Science at the archives came into being.
Thanks, Sanjana. Well, let me also welcome all of you this afternoon to the third lecture of the inaugural chair, the inaugural Obaid Siddiqi Chair in the History and Culture of Science. But before I start, to tell you a little bit about the role of the chair and also about the chair itself, I just want to thank NIMHANS for allowing us to hold this lecture here and in this part of town, because one of the aims of the chair is to spread the word about the archives and what happens in the Obaid Siddiqi chair across the city. So, but before I tell you about the role of the chair, I want to say a few words about Obaid Siddiqi himself, in whose name and memory we have instituted this chair. Obaid was born in 1932 in Basti in Uttar Pradesh, and he was one of 7 remarkable children, 5 of whom were women of great accomplishment, and with whom he shares a commitment to social transformation. And everything that Obaid did had some connection with this sort of core value that he and his siblings shared. Obaid studied at the Aligarh Muslim University in the late 40s and the early 50s, and even spent time in jail for his social activism. This was just after independence. However, his fascination with science, fortunately for science, lured him away from at least this kind of activism, but he never lost his sense of social justice and equity. Obaid then spent several years outside the country, bringing and asking questions around molecular biology, the modern biology that was shaping itself in the world at that time. And with a focus on particular questions, he was then led back to India to build, in fact, the molecular biology unit at the Tata Institute for Fundamental Research in the early 60s. So he started with this, with the building of molecular biology, and in fact, he is considered to be one of the architects of molecular biology in this country. Starting with TIFR in the early 60s, he also then went on to establish the National Center for Biological Science in the 90s. And he accomplished all this while he was part of the TIFR and conducting his research at a very high level. His research was, interestingly, in behavioral genetics, something that has some resonance with this campus. And eventually, Obaid became Professor Emeritus at the NCBS in Bangalore until his untimely demise in 2013. So Obaid leaves behind NCBS as one of his many legacies, and it is today a world-class institution, even if I may say so. We are located at the northern end of the city, most of you may know that, and are hosted by the University of Agricultural Sciences. We explore biology across all scales, from molecules to ecosystems, of space and of time, from nanoseconds to evolutionary time, and with a profoundly interdisciplinary lens. NCBS has also spawned the Institute for Stem Cell Science and Regenerative Medicine and the Center for Cell and Molecular Platforms. Both of these are institutions that connect biology to one biomedical translation and the other to entrepreneurship and incubation and biotechnology incubation. We also have created something called the Bangalore Life Science Cluster, along with one of our newest members, which is the Tata Institute for Genetics and Society. So those of you who remain at this end of town, I invite you to come and visit us at the northern end of the city. But all these efforts are a testimony to the founding principles of open-minded inquiry and societal engagement that Obaid envisioned. And therefore, we felt a need to build and create a chair who could lead a much-needed effort to bridge the gap between the sciences, social sciences, and the humanities, and foster a diverse and inclusive community of academics across disciplines. So with this focus and the archives as a foundation, and as the location, we imagined the chair would also build teaching and research capacity of academics at the intersection of science and humanities. A key component of this effort is also to deliver the Obaid Siddiqi lectures, and the 3 lectures that have happened this year, at least the 2 so far, and the one to follow down, have been, I must say, a really exemplary and reflect the scope of what is possible if one chooses the right person. And we hope that over the period of time, a sizable number will accumulate to enrich not only the life of the archives, but also in the city. So the inaugural Obaid Siddiqi chair, as I mentioned, is Dr. N.D. Madhusudan, and you will soon find out more about him and what he's going to talk about this afternoon from my colleague Uma. But I'd like to thank also our review committee who brought Madhu to this chair, Professor Janaki Nair, Ramachandra Guha, Sanjeev Jain, who's sitting in the audience, P. Balaram, Janaki Falke, and Uma herself. And of course, our head of the archives, Venkat, for all the effort in making such a occasion and such an event possible, but also for building the structure that allows us to host such a chair. This chair, again, I'm going to say, was made possible by generous support from TNQ Technologies, as Sanjana mentioned. But I also want to highlight the foresight of the chairperson and managing director, Miriam Ram, who also knew and admired Obaid and all that he stood for. And therefore, she felt it incumbent upon herself to help us build this program in his memory. So I now welcome Uma to introduce the Obaid Siddiqi chair. Thank you.
everyone. Can you hear me? I think maybe this is a little louder. Yeah. I'm Uma, and I'm at NCBS, and I've been working there for 17 years. And I think I've known Madhu almost as long. Madhu has a long-standing career as a conservation scientist. He's one of the founding members of the Nature Conservation Foundation, a very an NGO today which is pretty much leading the conservation science space in India. Many of you are from there and have heard of it. Madhu has worked on many topics, including human-elephant conflict, not to be called conflict anymore, human-elephant coexistence. And this transition of narrative also mirrors Madhu's trajectory in some sense. Most recently, he's joined and is a part of building the conservation, the coexistence consortium. So today Madhu is going to talk to us about something which is on many of our minds as scientists who work broadly on nature, on conservation, and should be on all of our minds because our environment and the future of our world is really dependent on correct stewardship, or at least appropriate stewardship. And that, I think, and I think Madhu believes as well, is at least somewhat contingent on science. So the dialogue between managers and scientists and the public in general is very fraught, and we'll hopefully hear more about this from Madhu. Very happy to have him as the first, the inaugural Obaid Siddiqi chair, and really looking forward to his talk. Madhu.
Audible? Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much, Uma. I would like to begin by expressing my very warm thanks to NCBS, the archives at NCBS, and TNQ Technologies who made this year that I've spent at NCBS possible. It's gone so fast, I can't believe a year is already over. It's also been a delightful time, and I have enjoyed every moment of it, and I will certainly cherish it as I go forward. So without further ado then, I'll just get to my talk today, which is about speaking science to conservation in India. Where does a river, or for that matter an idea, originate? This decision is always a matter of debate, but it's also a matter of convenience. So I shall begin reflecting on the relationship between the practice and science of conservation in India from the vantage point of a period between 1969 and 1973. The months preceding the enactment of this Wildlife Protection Act in 1972 had been a period of unusual activity around this topic. Early in her first term as the Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi had taken a deep and active personal interest in the matter of protecting nature and wildlife in particular. In 1969, she reconstituted and revived a then somewhat comatose Indian Board for Wildlife, bringing in her young, energetic Tourism Minister Karan Singh to head it. Thereafter, in mid-1969, India banned the export of tiger, leopard and lion skills right away after the new board was constituted. At the end of 1969, the International Union for Nature and Natural Resources, founded in 1948 by the UNESCO, held its 10th General Assembly in New Delhi. In that General Assembly, it released a resolution on the precarious state of the tiger, and supporting this resolution was the Indian Board for Wildlife, which threw in its weight too behind it. During the period of 1970 to 1971, the hunting of tigers was banned in India. The Indian Board for Wildlife commissioned an assessment of tiger numbers, and the WWF International planned an Operation Tiger with tiger range governments for the recovery of the species across its range. In 1972, we got our first comprehensive legislation on wildlife conservation called the Wildland Protection Act. And it was also the year that the Indian Board for Wildlife set up its Tiger Task Force. In 1973, Project Tiger was launched. So the key takeaways from this period is that the WLPA, the Wildlife Protection Act, set the aspiration for what India wanted to achieve for itself with conservation. Project Tiger, in some sense, became the exemplar and operationalized that aspiration with very clear time-bound goals. So, the idea of wildlife conservation in India was driven through the Wildlife Protection Act by two key impulses. And the first one I'm calling the species-centric impulse, where it meant according protection status to species, various wildlife species, and what we chose was a top predator. In the parlance of today, we might call it a flagship, an umbrella, or a keystone, but that was the species around which we chose to begin our engagement with species-centered conservation. The second was the habitat-centered impulse, where setting aside space for wildlife with tiered levels of protection. So we had already reserved forest under the colonial regime, but we chose to go with protected areas modeled on the American national parks system. So, but how did India arrive at this two-pronged approach? Where did these ideas about habitats and species themselves come from? And how, if at all, were they related to science? So, to take the first impulse of protected areas, conservation was largely motivated by aesthetics, the beauty and grandeur of nature, and the ethics, the responsibility and stewardship of nature by humans. The manner in which aesthetics and ethical sensibilities manifest across the globe is through the ideas of the idea of protected areas. Protected areas today are the centerpiece of how conservation of space on land and water is done. The human impulse to protect nature has had a very long past. Protection has often been for something. As an intentional and deliberate act, it has variously been motivated by ideas of reverence for nature, by utility, as well as by dominion, and thereby, in what it sets out to do, it has included and excluded various groups of people. So, protection has existed as a sentiment which, for as long as humanity has been around. But what's important to note is that protection as a doctrine is something that is tied very closely to the empires, to the existence of the nation state, the modern nation state, and has spread through the empire's territorial project, which has included forest reservation and land annexation. Although this was in the post-Enlightenment era, knowledge, especially scientific knowledge, did not seem to have a very large role to play in the sequestration of nature, other than to support its aesthetic, utilitarian, or territorial objectives. So, the world's first true national park came in 1872 with the dedication of the Yellowstone National Park by the United States law as a public park or pleasuring ground for the benefit and enjoyment of the people, harking back to the powerful aesthetic and ethical motivations for the creation of protected spaces. This idea of beautiful spaces protected for the public emerged in several other countries around the same time, in Australia, in Canada, in South Africa, in New Zealand, protecting various kinds of landscapes between 1866 and 1887. Beyond the aesthetics and the ethics, what role did they serve? Did they have any scientific value at all? These were reasonable questions to ask of these set-aside spaces during the post-Enlightenment period. So this was indeed the kind of question that scientists of the time, like Frederick Clements, considered in their work. Clements was an American ecologist studying plant communities. He developed ideas of succession and climax in vegetation communities, where a climax community was thought to be stable. The idea that nature would come to rest in a timeless and stable state suggested a balance of nature, which was what the real wilderness project was about. the idea of balance made it possible to frame human manipulation as disturbance and as something that threw nature out of its balance. Therefore, removing humans would restore the balance and allow nature to work its way back to stability. And it also allowed the possibility that all was not lost and that nature would come back, and gave the scientific foundation to the idea that once people are removed, time would heal all of nature's wounds. However, another ecologist, Henry Gleason, differed. He said that no two patches of the same community are exactly alike, and there is no universal climax. There is variation over space and time, and this produces variation in the environment and then in the vegetation itself. Communities reflect this historic ebb and flow. Nature looks constant if you are, in his words, not looking closely or looking for long. There is succession with no end. Most ecologists today agree that populations grow and fall, and unpredictable events constantly disrupt any equilibrium that might begin to develop. Clement's ecology gave strength to the philosophical position that nature would work best in the absence of humans. This idea continues to resonate to this day. It has less to do with scientific accuracy than to do with non-scientific values. Most environmentalists believe in a balance of nature that is profoundly disturbed by human activity and which is possible to reverse simply by the removal of people. Although Gleason's view is greatly corroborated by ecological research that followed, Clement's ideas, while largely abandoned by science, still have a very powerful hold among environmentalists and policymakers and drive the impulse to create exclusive reserves for wildlife and nature. India's aspiration to protect wild habitats where we do nothing and allow no one else to do anything, as Kailash Sankla, the founding director of Project Tiger, said, very much drew on these ideas of Clement's. In 1967, MacArthur and Wilson proposed the theory of island biogeography. It basically said that islands that were larger or closer to the mainland had more species. The farther and smaller islands had fewer species. This was due to the processes of extinction and colonization that proceeded at different rates on large and small, distant and near islands. This idea quickly made a leap from the oceanic islands to terrestrial protected areas, which were then seen as islands in a sea of human activity where a farther and smaller habitat island inexorably lost plant and animal species. This is why protected areas needed to be as large as possible. Although it didn't create the desire for large reserves, it provided the scientific backing and reinforcement for the idea. Right in 1967, following this theory, the IUCN excluded small areas, as it called them, from a list of protected areas it made around the world. By 1973, the IUCN was using the island biogeography theory as a justification for why national parks and sanctuaries needed to be large, which was also embraced by Project Tiger in India. This was contrasted with a body of work and a debate called the single large or several small, where research showed that a network of small interconnected reserves could potentially offer advantages over a single large reserve in terms of protecting a larger complement of species diversity, offering greater resilience to disease outbreaks, but these would have to be necessarily in a human-dominated matrix and may need active management through human agency. Both ideas that remained aesthetically unappealing even to most ecologists. So, research also was carried out that blended ecological understanding with the pragmatism research that blended ecological understanding with pragmatism suggested that rather than focus on all species in a given area, it made sense to prioritize species protection, and that would extend or amplify the effects of conservation to a wider community. Top predators like tigers that India had chosen to prioritize featured prominently among such species. Meanwhile, population modeling, advances in demographic and genetic analysis began to suggest that small populations suffered from a high risk of chance extinctions. This led to the biological concept of minimal viable populations. In 1969, the cat biologist Paul Lehausen said that at the IUCN conference in Delhi, that to be viable, tiger populations needed to have at least 300 individuals. But staggeringly, going back to 1952, M. Krishnan, a naturalist, wrote about the great Indian bustard using vocabulary that presages this very concept. This was a good 20 years before a lot of the scientific work came in. And it is important to remember that M. Krishnan was part of the Indian Board for Wildlife and had a big role to play in all the decisions that were being made. So if you look at where the Indian Wildlife Protection Act's habitat-centric and species-centric impulses came from, they were, by and large, aesthetic and ethical. Aesthetics and ethics were also key motivators of conservation practice, while science largely brought up the rear, providing reasoning and explanation for those value-based choices. As we saw, India's conservation approach did have scientific justifications, if not scientific foundations. But moving forward too, with Project Tiger, India did not have the direct involvement of scientists. India did not even have ecologists at that time. Given the involvement of the IUCN, WWF International and the Smithsonian Institution in the plans of Project Tiger, there was considerable opportunity and even pressure at that point to enlist and engage scientific expertise from overseas in conservation planning and practice. In fact, while India accepted foreign funding for Project Tiger, it quietly but emphatically spurned several repeated efforts and considerable pressure from donors to bring American and other foreign scientists into this effort, despite having no formal in-country scientific expertise in ecology or wildlife biology. To understand why, it is necessary to get a sense of the geopolitics of the time. This was the height of the Cold War period, and a starving India was receiving food aid from the United States. And yet, India had decided to oppose the United States in the Vietnam War. In addition, in the recent Bangladesh war, the United States had leaned towards Pakistan. So, as journalist Inder Malhotra recalled, infuriated by India's criticism of American bombings of Hanoi and Haiphong in the course of the Vietnam War, the irascible Texan Lyndon Johnson put food shipments on such a tight leash that India literally lived from ship to mouth. With every morsel we swallowed a little humiliation. When told that Indians were saying exactly the same things as the UN Secretary General and the Pope were, Johnson had retorted, "The Pope and the Secretary General do not need our wheat." Many in India started demanding that we should say no to American wheat. Sensibly, Indira Gandhi had said nothing. Privately, she told some confidants, if food imports stop, these ladies and gentlemen won't suffer. Only the poor will starve. Even as she phoned the White House for more food, she told an aide that in December of 1996, "I don't ever want us to beg for food again." Just as this spurred in Indian agricultural scientists a sense of nationalism, the expectation perhaps was that India's foresters would similarly rise to the challenge, of saving the tiger, leading a wider aspiration within the government and bureaucracy for India to be much more self-sufficient without having to lean on foreign support. The resistance to scientific imperialism also underpinned the decision to keep foreign scientists out. A veritable who's who of conservation science of the time were denied entry. George Schaller, after his work in Kanha in Madhya Pradesh that resulted in the seminal book The Deer and the Tiger, was denied permission to work in the Himalaya. He eventually did the work that resulted in the mountain monarchs and the stones of silence, working mostly in Pakistan, Nepal, and China. After 2 years of parleys, Juan Spilett, who was denied permission in 1972 to work in India, went on to work on chital in Sri Lanka. Similarly, Tom Fruce from the University of Chicago, who wanted to study rhinos in Kaziranga, was turned away in 1973. Even foreign offers to build local capacity were rebuffed. Even when the Smithsonian Institution proposed to set up 3 large research and training centers in Gir, Corbett and Kaziranga that would train both Indian and US students to study the lion, the tiger and the rhino with the BNHS and the Worldwide Fund for Nature, they were denied permission. India's conservation elite tried to raise these issues at the highest levels. Zafar Fateh Ali protested to Karan Singh about how scientists from outside were being spurned, but nothing came of it. For his part, Dylan Ripley, the director of the Smithsonian Institution, wrote to Guy Montfort of the WWF, who had played a key role in international fundraising for Project Tiger, about not being allowed to work in India and urging him to find ways find some way by which foreign scientists could be involved, but that too had no effect. The original rift between conservation science and conservation practice in India, it would appear, began here. Having spurned US scientists, but having committed to science, India still had to reassure donors of her ability to monitor recovery of tiger populations. It meant tiger numbers had to be counted accurately and reliably. At this point, India had a 100-year history of scientific forestry. 8 years prior to 1872, when Yellowstone became a national park, the colonial government in India had already created the Imperial Forest Department, passed the Indian Forest Act, and began reserving forests for timber. This was also an assertion of dominion and power. Now in 1972, in the post-independence avatar of the Forest Service, there was both institutional memory and something like self-confidence in their capacity to deliver on the demands of a new conservation project, the demands that a new conservation project was placing on them. So the Indian forest bureaucracy thought itself completely up to the challenge of being able to devise scientific methods to monitor and count tigers. In fact, 2 years earlier in 1970, the forester Saroj Raj Chaudhary had devised a method of censusing tigers on the basis of pug marks, which was used to arrive at a population of 1,827 tigers. This number became the call to action for what would in 1973 become Project Tiger. Thereafter, this method became the scientific standard that India would use to count tigers across the entire country. This approach seemed to be working. More and more protected areas were created, and the tigers seemed to be recovering. In 1983, the then director of Project Tiger presented a paper at the World Parks Congress stating rhetorically, "What to do when you've succeeded?" Project Tiger 10 years later. This approach now began to expand beyond tiger reserves to the protection of other species and habitats. But these claims on the sustainability of its success would be tested in the 1990s and in the 2000s. Although Project Tiger did come away at the point in 1983 looking like a success, the absence of science and scientific methods remained etched into the Wildlife Protection Act. Although the official structures and practice of wildlife conservation had little space for formal conservation science, it nevertheless continued to grow outside this space. Having no place within the country in which to train, a significant fraction of the first generation of Indian ecologists and conservation scientists who emerged in the 1970s and 80s owed their training and capacity to a range of American institutions which they were able to access through private means. By 1982, the government had started the Wildlife Institute of India in Dehradun, mainly to train foresters, but in time also brought foreign scientists as faculty to train young Indians in conservation science as a formal academic discipline. So in less than 15 years since the Wildlife Protection Act, we had a fair capacity in wildlife biology, ecology, and conservation science as a result both of private initiative and the government's own investments into training conservation scientists. Yet, science itself was still not part of the Wildlife Protection Act, and the very nature of conservation science continued to make the forest bureaucracy very varied. Here, it is useful to understand of the different kind of what. Here, it's useful to understand of what conservation science consists. There are four broad ideas or areas of scientific inquiry that make up what we together call conservation science. It involves the understanding of natural history, ecology, and the behavior of species. It includes the monitoring of status of habitats and species over space and time. It involves the diagnosis of conservation problems and threats and predicting future scenarios. But then you have to do conservation. Therefore, there is the step that involves the choice, the design, and implementation of conservation interventions, which is typically a socio-political rather than a scientific process. But after that, there is the step of assessing the impact and the effectiveness of conservation interventions. The key point to bear in mind here is that the third and fourth areas of inquiry, the diagnosis of conservation problems and threats and the assessing of impact and effectiveness of conservation, can throw up facts that are awkward and inconvenient to the forest bureaucracy. Within the government structure itself, I saw as a student at the Wildlife Institute of India that when research showed up a large number of turtles dying or mining for coal and limestone was disrupting habitat connectivity for elephants, the researchers making these findings were asked to pull back for fear of offending the state and its conservation apparatus. As a result, over time, access to protected areas, which are the very laboratories and libraries of nature in which the conservation scientists carries out their work, has been heavily gated and in some cases entirely closed. In the words of historian Michael Lewis, most scientists making management recommendations dealt with protected areas and implicitly infringed upon the forester's turf. A conflict between these two groups, neither of whom tried to understand or work with the other, was in the making, and the biologists would discover that government power ultimately trumps scientific virtue. So this resulted in a veritable permit raj by the forest bureaucracy and a steadily widening rift between knowledge and practice. A wide range of scientific activities were restricted, and allowances, if any, came to be based less on any well-defined process and much more on the whimsy of individual foresters and their perceptions, both of the significance and the possible conflicts arising from the research. The tight regulation of research in natural areas by the forest bureaucracy resulted in much indignation within the conservation science community. In fact, 16 years ago, I was co-author on a paper decrying the stranglehold of the forest department on wildlife research in India and calling for reforms. Needless to say, nothing changed. The resultant impact on science has been that it has ended up organizing itself into what I'm calling three types of research in order to cope with these challenges and uncertainties. First, the anodyne, which is a range of relatively innocuous research, often curiosity-driven, providing valuable baselines without direct intersections with management or conservation practice, including basic natural history, ecology and behavior, as well as biological inventories and surveys. The second is the aligned, which is scientific work aligned with the orientations of the state and the management agency, often carried out to explain or validate choices made in conservation practice. For example, after commercial forestry was halted in areas earmarked for tiger conservation, studies were carried out in some sites to examine and to demonstrate the effect of forestry practices such as clear cuts and monocultures on bird communities. Other examples included studies carried out to develop means of mitigating the impact of infrastructure projects sanctioned within wildlife habitats. The third are adversarial projects, in which research is driven with a view to interrogate the prevailing conservation practices, leading, if need be, to the challenge of prevailing beliefs, policies, and actions. For example, in the mid-1980s, Ulas Karant carried out a study to test how reliably foresters who were censusing tigers in the field could enumerate tigers from their pug marks. He systematically gathered several pug mark tracings from 4 known captive tigers from 2 kinds of soil substrate and asked foresters to enumerate them. None of them could correctly recognize the pug marks as having come from 4 individual tigers, and determined instead that the tracing belonged to anywhere between 6 and 24 different individual tigers. Beyond this test, he also framed the tiger census exercise in a sampling framework to challenge the validity of the pug mark census methodology, and which was adopted as a gold standard in India. Yet, none of his work brought about any change at that time. Although by and large anodyne and aligned research of various kinds are still permitted, despite delays and difficulties, carrying out conservation science work that critiques or challenges prevalent practices of conservation are seldom welcome. When Raghunandan Chundawat, the scientist from the government-run Wildlife Institute of India, repeatedly warned park administration of the disappearance of tigers that he had radio collared in a tiger reserve, that it might point to systematic poisoning and poaching of these cats, these possibilities were vociferously denied, his permissions were withdrawn, and his long-term study on tigers was summarily halted. Yet, in a few years, his anxieties were vindicated when it had to be publicly admitted that the tiger reserve had indeed lost all its tigers to poisoning and poaching. All these impediments notwithstanding, conservation science has continued to push forward. What have been the outcomes of such scientific research, and how are they relevant to the key impulses that underpin India's conservation practice? That is, the protection of species and the protection of habitats. Let's look at some examples. What does species protection mean when one goes beyond a single species, as one was with the tiger? What do the outcomes of conservation science tell us? And how does conservation practice relate to it? What does conservation science tell us about some of the ways in which we practice habitat-centric conservation? It is useful to analyze these in the light of a recent amendment proposed to the Wildlife Protection Act in its 50th year of enactment. 50 years seems like a reasonable period of time over which to assess the percolation and the partnership of conservation science with conservation practice. So, to take the first example, India has about 1,300 species of birds, and the proposed amendment assigns birds to 2 levels of protection, a higher Schedule 1 and a lower Schedule 2. Yet, there are glaring discrepancies that exist from such a listing. So, for instance, there are serious exclusion errors where about 60 threatened species are missing from Schedule 1, which is the highest protection status. There are 440 species that are missing from both schedules. And similarly, there are serious inclusion errors where 20 species of least conservation concern are given the highest levels of protection. Let us take a closer look. The peafowl, a species that is both widely distributed and increasing in population. This tells you how widely it is distributed, and this tells you what its population trends are over the last couple of decades. This species is assigned to the highest level of protection, whereas the crested tree swift, a bird distributed over a reasonably large area, but seen to be declining over the last 2 decades, is not listed in either schedule. Likewise, the Malabar grey hornbill, which has a much more restricted distribution as an endemic of the Western Ghats and appears to be in decline, is not listed either. Finally, the Nilgiri laughing thrush, a species with a remarkably small distribution and very uncertain population trends too, doesn't find a place in any of the schedules. So more broadly, conservation science that has produced assessments of 867 species involving multiple institutions in the generation of conservation science has not found a place in making decisions on the level of protection to offer different bird species. Of the 867 species that were assessed, none were used in making the determination on what protection status to give different species. Beyond birds, a large set of collective effort by hundreds of conservation scientists to assess conservation status of hundreds of other taxa, from plants and invertebrates to amphibians and reptiles, again was simply not used in the process of according protection status to species. If this is a glimpse of how conservation science fares when conservation policy or practice focuses on species, we must also ask what are some of the insights that emerge when we look at how conservation science understands the Wildlife Protection Act's habitat-centric impulse on what kind of habitats to protect and how the practice and implementation of conservation relates to it. Science tells us that in the course of our conservation practice, we have mostly protected our forests. Over 3/4 of the protected areas we have set up are in forests. All that is very well. But if you look at another ecosystem, which are open natural ecosystems that are of a similar extent as forests, there are less than 5% of our protected areas that provide any protection to these vast and diverse ecosystems as well. Second, conservation practice is also predicated on the assumption that the species-centric impulse of the Wildlife Protection Act and the habitat-centric impulse are aligned. As a matter of fact, this is largely true with tigers. A species that has protection is largely found on lands that are protected, so it works out very well. But does this happen everywhere? Conservation science shows us that there are situations like with elephants where a protected species can occur in habitats that are simply not protected or cannot be protected. Conservation practice is having to deal with the consequences of this mismatch in terms of dozens of human and elephant deaths besides crop losses, whereas a vision for managing this collision between the species-centric and the habitat-centric conservation impulses guided by conservation science is still missing. Now let's look at situations where the rigid and uncompromising protection of a habitat as part of conservation practice can itself mean hurting a protected species badly. As Dr. Asad Rehmani of the BNHS wrote about bustards and grasslands. In other words, bustard conservation is nothing but a sustainable utilization of our grasslands for the benefit of livestock, villages, and wildlife. However, as usual, the Forest Department did not recognize the role of local people in saving the Great Indian Bustard. As soon as an area was declared a bustard sanctuary, they put all sorts of restrictions on villagers. Instead of utilizing villagers in eco-restoration of degraded land, curbs were put on their traditional land use. So not only are there species and habitats adapted to disturbance. So this is a picture also I want to say of bustard habitat where protection has essentially resulted in the invasion of open grasslands by trees, which is really not bustard habitat. So you can protect and hurt a species that depends on grasslands. Not only are there species and habitats adapted to disturbance, but they may also be species and habitats like savanna that are dependent on such disturbance for their survival, such as regimes of grazing and fire, which are really integral to them. Further, there are ecologies where the boundaries are fluid. There are wetlands, aquatic ecosystems, marine systems, where both ecological processes and the economic processes of people that interface with them do not obey boundaries. And there are serious limitations of a protected area focused approach to conserving these habitats. These examples contradict a conservation practice emerging from the empiricism of foresters who draw on their experience of commercial forestry, which do not apply to these markedly different ecologies of species and habitats. Finally, the gating of science itself hinders us from obtaining key information and insight needed to understand catastrophic declines of species like vultures. This is a study that talks about how once a vulture decline was reported, the species was put on Schedule 1, which basically meant it became impossible to collect samples to find out what was actually causing the decline in vultures. So this restriction influenced, as it says, both the number of carcasses obtained and the distribution of collection localities. So the way in which we restrict science itself impedes our understanding of situations where we want to intervene and help in conservation. So the upshot of this is that even after 50 years, conservation largely remains outside the edifice of the state's conservation apparatus. Conservation practice, disheartening as this may be, is not out there waiting for the next new insight to emerge from conservation science. What began as a momentary rift between the practice and science of conservation owing to a very peculiar geopolitical contingency assumed a larger structural proportion as it was kept out of the Wildlife Protection Act and all associated processes. But today, this rift has widened into a yawning cultural chasm between the science and practice of conservation. Today, I have mostly spoken about the relationship between conservation science and conservation practice as the relationship between knowledge and the state. But it is much more than just that. I will briefly touch upon two issues here. While I have extensively discussed disagreements between conservation science and conservation practice, there is one unfortunate area of convergence in their unequal relationship with the grounded knowledge of local communities that have lived in long and intimate relationships with nature. Very often, the kind of skill needed to conduct conservation research, whether it is to navigate unfamiliar natural landscapes or to gather data on species, relationships, and phenomena, has been situated within India's diverse local communities and their vast lived experience. For decades, researchers have depended heavily on local people, not only as guides to natural habitats, but also as interpreters of interactions between the natural and human world. Likewise, the forest bureaucracy has tapped them for essential knowledge: how to use and control fires in forests, how to recognize individual tigers from their tracks, how to track wildlife, and much else. This is not recent, however. Colonial foresters for over a century had similarly conscripted and appropriated local knowledge and skill for forestry operations like raising nurseries, capturing and taming wild elephants, using them in harvesting timber, all while dispossessing the same communities of their lands to create reserve forests. Post-independence, this skewed relationship has persisted. Indian society, with its long history of structural inequities, has disallowed local communities to be directly credited for these contributions to conservation science and to conservation practice. Conservation science has also fared poorly in recognizing the long and unusual history of coexistence that indigenous communities have had with large and potentially dangerous wild species. Moving forward, it is important that conservation scientists are more mindful of their largely extractive relationships with the knowledge of local communities and can reflect on a better practice of their trade. Thankfully, many younger colleagues are leading the way here, and we have much to learn from them. Second, the vast and increasingly pervasive influence of the capitalistic economic order on both science and practice of conservation is something that is concerning. There are newer and newer ways in which nature is being imagined, reimagined, and commodified. If we are not ready, if we are not already in the middle of it, we are certainly seeing the beginnings of a situation where capitalism co-opts both the science and the practice of nature conservation into its logic of commodifying, capturing, and trading in nature, thereby further deepening the social and economic inequities that have grown so vastly in recent decades. How is conservation science to respond to such powers and pressures? How do we, as conservation scientists, see and understand the place of science in a world of shifting power centers. Conservation science has faced and continues to face various challenges, from being denied access to its place of work and its source materials, to having its findings questioned, to legal action against scientists. However, this is rather mild compared to the impacts of conservation practice itself. However, this is rather mild compared to the impacts conservation practice itself has had on local communities for decades, including coercive relocations, the loss of livelihood resources, and the ever-present threat of legal action against the fulfillment of basic human needs. Conservation science, let's face it, is half activism. If we brought to our campaign for the incorporation of science into conservation practice the very values we bring to our science itself, we might do better. For instance, the openness and learning from other similar struggles. Successes in causes adjacent to conservation, like the demand for forest rights among indigenous communities, have come from painstakingly forged nationwide alliances across ideological and political lines and hard-fought battles stretching over decades. We have made no effort that is comparable, and yet we seek change which will have significant ramifications. The recognition for science that we seek from the state will not come at the speed or with the completeness that we hope for. States are notoriously resistant to change, especially change that opens them up to scrutiny. As the less powerful and the more needy partner in this relationship, this dialogue will doubtless be difficult. Nevertheless, it is one worth striving for, and persist we must. Thank you for your attention and time. Good evening.
Thank you, Madhu, for that insightful lecture and for so skillfully drawing the connections between history, politics, and conservation to show this tension between practice and science. We will now be open to questions from members of the audience. We will be passing around mics. Kindly use the mics so you are audible to the recording as well.
Thank you for that, Madhu. It was really, I felt that the call you gave at the end was very, very important, not only from the point of view of science, but from the point of view of various disciplines, even in the humanities, where we don't look at local knowledge at all, but we say, this is history, this is sociology, and we are not attentive to that. I just had a comment about something you said earlier, because I'm curious about it, is, when you're looking at the 60s and you're talking about the framing of this act and how American foreign scientists were not welcomed, and that was how this whole conservation, this idea of conservation gets framed. I was wondering why that was so. I'm just thinking aloud here. Because when we look at the history of management institutions, which depended so much on Ford Foundation, MIT, Harvard, they were very open. And during the Vietnam War too, there were all these management, I won't call them management gurus, but professors coming from MIT, coming from Harvard, and teaching at both IIM Calcutta and Ahmedabad. And at the same time, Calcutta, which I've studied, was interesting because it had people like Barunde and Ashok Mitra, left economists and economic historians teaching there. And, there didn't seem to be a problem with letting the Ford Foundation come in at that time. And yet I wondered why this was the case with conservation. And one of the answers that I'm thinking aloud again is possibly because management was seen as a means of control, because they would often talk about how engineers have to be trained to manage labor, because labor is a problem. And so they don't mind this, I suppose, as much as the rest. I don't know. And I'm just throwing that out there because it's very interesting that there are differences here.
Yeah, I'm not, is this, can you
I can read this.
I'm not really very conversant with all the things that were happening around that period and so on. But I can think of a few things that may be relevant. One, the Department of Forests is under the Ministry of Agriculture. So there is a lot of this tension that's about food and self-sufficiency of food, and I think this is being most intensely perceived and felt as a pressure and of expectation within that key ministry, which is supposed to kind of get its act together and make India self-sufficient in terms of food. So the Forest Department is under the Ministry of Agriculture at that point of time. Second is the fact that even at that time, the Forest Department is a 100-year-old bureaucracy, and there is a way in which it can actually get together and align itself around a certain idea and have it permeate through the ranks. And this is also something which may have played a part in making this such a coherent response in this domain and distinct from other domains which you mentioned about.
Yeah, sounds.
Is there someone else? Yeah, so I mean, actually also, the IIMs are academic institutions, and at the same time, the Wildlife Institute of India is also coming up. So in a way, international engagement with education and knowledge is okay, but these are natural resources which seem to be very much belonging to the state. Knowledge, education, research almost seems open and not controlled by boundaries, but this belongs to the state. I don't know whether that makes sense, and maybe that's so.
I think a stronger sense of territoriality is certainly a valid explanation as well.
And I mean, of course, this is something we all know, but the divide also is possibly because the people who implement the practice are in no way trained in science. I mean, they have no cognizance, appreciation, or interest in science or the scientific method. So then they can never be integration of science or absorption of science. And that, unless that changes as well, I'm not sure how that can change. I don't know what your thoughts are.
I love it. Thanks for an extremely eye-opening talk. I was just wondering, you said there was 100 years of forestry in India, and then the 1970s, the Wildland Protection Act comes about in this Cold War scenario. But at the same time, I mean, the forest protection that was before and in colonial times is also extremely extractive, right? So if the state was to continue with that same mode of an extractive engagement with forests, right? I mean, in a colonial mode and just continuing on. Of course, science would be necessarily something that needed to be aligned with that whole enterprise, right? So I'm just wondering whether just simply declaring forests and habitats, habitats as aesthetic protected areas, but continuing this extractive practice, would just, would necessarily have to leave something out that we're questioning.
Sorry, I missed the last part.
Would have to leave something out that we're questioning of that practice, right? Because conservation science would be questioning of this extractive practice.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering whether, if you brought science into the equation, you'd have to stop everything else.
Yes, and I think that is a conservation science, unlike many other kinds of science, is deeply normative and value-based. Every conservation scientist has a value orientation, and the entire discipline aggregates into value orientations. And I think it is in the very nature of this science that it takes stances on social activities and so on normatively takes stances. So it's not merely a question of functional or scientific postulates. It also includes normative postulates that come into the picture. And you're right, I think had extraction continued and had science had to come in, it would have again resulted, and this is really the place where there is always a conflict, because I think there are normative positions that scientists are often called upon to take just because of having to be good scientists in that discipline. And that would always lead to a conflict, a contestation, a confrontation, and that's where power plays out eventually. So.
Hello, thank you for this wonderful talk.
Speak up.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. I was wondering if there are some case studies where the researcher-local community relationship has moved beyond the extractive nature. And secondly, if there are none, what are the possible spaces where researchers could interact more positively with local communities rather than just using their indigenous knowledge?
I think there is at some level this is generational, and I think at some level this is also an issue of more disciplinary orientation. People who are much more tuned into aspects of conservation science that are hard data gathering and so on are less inclined to think about the local participants in their research as bearers of knowledge, and often, to state it a little strongly, they basically are using their labor rather than their knowledge, and that does make it extractive. But I think in many contexts where people come with a different kind of orientation, for instance, say with a training and an orientation in political ecology, they are already looking at relationships, they are looking at power within different constituents who appear on a landscape, the relationships, they are sensitive to all of this. And I think this is therefore something that this kind of thinking and disciplinary orientation wasn't even available during the earlier training of conservation scientists. This has certainly come in to conservation science as it has gotten genuinely more interdisciplinary and has incorporated elements of critique into the way it functions, and the politics around which conservation is always poised. So this has, I think, led to the fact that a lot of the younger people are really leading the way here, because I think they have thought a lot more about it. They are much more grounded in social theory and such critique that does raise these kinds of questions very often. And I don't think I can say I know all the places where this relationship has taken a turn for the better, but there are many, many young people who are working in relationships that are very, very different from the way their seniors would have worked. An example which you might be familiar with as well is the kind of work that's been going on with the Mishmis, the Idu Mishmi and so on in Dibang in Arunachal. So whether they have always come in alongside the researcher as equal participants in the research, not merely in going and collecting data, but helping frame the questions, design the methods, and also interpret and use the information, including the ownership of data that has been collected and so on. These are unusual and very, unfortunately unusual, but hopefully more common as we go forward, I hope. Ways of engaging with local communities, and I can just hope that we start reflecting and doing better with this. We certainly need to.
Sorry to go back into the historical aspect, but at the time of independence, there were two biological spaces, the forest and the humans. The Indian Medical Service was disbanded. Why not the IFS? The healthcare was left entirely on its own. Why not the Indian Forest Service? What was so critical about controlling forests, which was less important than the health of humans?
Territory is a very simple thing that suggests itself, I think. To leave an entire domain of human well-being unattended might still have been all right, but to leave large tracts of land unattended would have been much more contentious. I mean, this is not a very well thought out answer, but this is one very obvious kind of difference that jumps out.
Right. But to look at medicine or health policy, we have the same issues. You have sentinel diseases. You have set up centers for cardiac, surgery. The vast majority of health disease is actually ecological and spread out. But to create these sentinel diseases and to invest a lot in those sentinel diseases, whether it's cancer or heart or various kinds of medical technologies, ultimately there has to be a balance between both the highly technocratic medicine and the wider public awareness of health and welfare as an ecological principle. You can't do without either, actually.
Absolutely.
So you need some kind of match between both approaches. Now, in conservation science, how do we achieve that? Because we can see this alarming drop in absolute numbers on the street lights of Bangalore are devoid of insects. Completely. Insect-eating birds have almost disappeared. But we still want more and more light. We want to put more and more LED lights which confuse the birds. So how do we coordinate these things so that even simple principles of ecological planning of our lived spaces actually keep in mind these kinds of inputs? Because the vast amount of ecological thing is occurring not in those forests, but in the lands all over.
I wish I had a simple answer. I think you're asking a very important and profound question, but I really don't know what the way. Obviously it must involve a greater activation and engagement of citizens in this. There is, as scientists, we've generally come at it through rationality, but I think the very basis of human relationship with nature is much more in the affective rather than in the intellectual. And I don't think we've really done enough to try and take what we know and help make people feel differently about this. And that, I think, remains an area of where much more thinking and work is needed.
Thanks for not holding back today, Madhu. Good talk.
Thank you.
I was wondering what would have possibly, the role of scientific institutions at that point in time when these legislatures were being thought about. And if at all any of these scientific institutes had stepped in and spoken about, or talked about how science could play a very important role.
Did you have specific institutions in mind?
No, but perhaps the universities, the universities across the country. If at all they had played any role, if we know at all.
I mean, in the literature I have looked at, that is, I have not encountered so much of people from the universities even being participating in these kind of activities or having. I may be mistaken from the. I'm talking of the early 70s. Subsequently, I think there are many situations where things changed, as in, for instance, the Silent Valley movement and so on. I think this is not, you are asking me about the point of time when legislations and policies of very long-term impact were being made. Not at that time, but there have been many popular movements in which they've definitely participated and so on. But the institutions that were definitely found themselves at the intersections of various directions from which they were both the pursuit of these opportunity and pressures was happening, were institutions like WWF, which already existed in India, the Bombay Naturalistic Society, which had also been in existence for a very long time. And as I said, at that point of time, unfortunately, I think if one were for a moment to sympathize with the nationalistic anxieties of the Indian states and the pressure that it put on its bureaucracy to act in a more nationalistic way, I think the kind of directions from which these institutions and people from these institutions came, they basically saw science as something that was more universal, and they allied much more with the need to bring in science, even if it came from outside. That was the importance of science. But what I think the byproduct of such an articulation by an elite of conservation or the set of elite environmentalists in India, was that they increased their cultural distance from the issues that concerned the Indian nation and the bureaucracy at that point of time, which was like this had to have a nationalistic response. So in that sense, there wasn't a bridging of the concerns that bureaucrats and the government may have had about how to kind of tiptoe one's way through these difficult geopolitical moments, and on the other, the recognition that science had value, it was universal and had to be brought in. I don't think there was a bridge between the two which could have been in hindsight built, but why that did not happen is not something I am able to speculate on.
If I may ask a follow-up, at that time when possibly Indira Gandhi was, we were cordoning off these national parks for protection, how is it that the sociologists and people studying with, working with indigenous people, human rights organizations, did they ever sort of think and say, or protest, or that perhaps this was an injustice?
I think there has always been local resistance. I must say that I'm not reflecting any received knowledge, but I think by and large there has always been local resistance to imposition of restrictions and kind of gating of spaces and all of that over which people have had claims. And by and large it's worked itself out in such a way that transactionally in day-to-day transactions, the law says one thing, but the peace on the ground is achieved through a completely different and pragmatic interpretation of how these play out. Or there are tensions that kind of flare up and subside, but I don't know of, it's my ignorance, that I don't know of any larger systematic responses and pushbacks from what might be like rights groups of that time or people who spoke for the human community that may have been affected in this. I'm not aware.
Hi Madhu, that was a wonderful, sorry. I mean, from all the discussions till now, it's quite clear that if any change has to be made, it takes a lot of effort. But do you think as individuals, like the societal individuals, what steps can we take at an individual basis that can promote conservation, which we are already not practicing right now?
This is always it's an important question, and I think it really is what connects people to conservation. So in that sense, I think it's a very important question, but also a hard one to answer because not everyone can really contribute in the same way. The very broad and kind of the answer that I often give to a question like this is that conservation is about collective action. And I think the most important way in which a citizen can participate in something like conservation is to be part of these collective, of any kind of a collective action. Because I think it's only in the aligned actions of multiple people acting together towards something that's much more coherent that we have greater likelihood of success that goes beyond just the satisfaction of having done something which is not carried a plastic bag or carried a cloth bag or whatever it is. That, I mean, I don't mean to belittle those efforts, but I think if one really wants to do something that is meaningful at an aggregate scale, it is really the work of collectives. And I think the most important thing a citizen or an individual can do is to participate in collectives.
Thank you, Madhu, for your time.
Thank you all for your attention and time.
I'd like to bring this event to a close by thanking you all for joining us on a Saturday evening. Thank you to Professor Sanjeev Jain, to the PR office at NIMHANS, and the technical team at NIMHANS, without whom this lecture would not be possible. As always, the archives at NCBS is open for visitors, so please do get in touch and hope to see you soon. Please join us for refreshments outside as well. Thank you and good night.
Record